Before we can dive into Pink Floyd's first album, it's best to start at the beginning. And just for some context here, I thought it best to start at the beginning of my discovery of Pink Floyd. I still remember the first time I spun my dad's copy of Dark Side of the Moon, which he showed off, in character, for the History of Rock the 1970s. You carry that with you everywhere you go?
Oh yeah. I don't have a record player anymore.
Shortly afterwards, I watched Classic Album's Making of Dark Side of the Moon, which was my first proper introduction to their story. I'll talk about that in detail later. But the documentary presented me with an intriguing mystery.
After Syd went crazy in '68 and Dave joined.
Who is Syd? I gathered from the documentary that Syd Barrett was their original leader and songwriter, but it didn't give me much else to go on. You have to understand, this was the early 2000s. It wasn't like you could just go on YouTube and watch a clip of Syd Barrett playing live. We didn't have iTunes yet, so physical media was still the only legal way to discover music. And already a lot of my music friends were telling me, oh, Syd is the real Pink Floyd. So this myth began to grow in my mind about Syd Barrett. What kind of music did he make? And why did he leave? Well, finally, I borrowed my friend's copy of their Echoes compilation, where I got kind of a brief overview of their career. And finally, I was introduced to the earliest tunes with Syd Barrett. And after being told for such a long time what a genius Syd Barrett was, even by a friend of mine who claimed he was a better guitarist than David Gilmour, I thought it was interesting.
Arnold Layne.
I mean, it was just so radically different from what I was used to. Syd's Pink Floyd was practically a different band. It's like listening to Peter Green's version of Fleetwood Mac versus the iconic Buckingham Nicks lineup. And while I love Peter Green's original version of Fleetwood Mac, I'm honestly not the biggest fan of Syd Barrett.
Kill the monster!
Well, that didn't take long. Still, I did find it intriguing. Syd was not a conventional writer or guitar player, and I really admire that. To stand out in a prolific year like 1967, let alone influence so many artists, is not an easy task. Cream had just formed, Jimi Hendrix was taking England by storm, the Beatles had already released Revolver, and 1967 was a big year for rock and roll in England. And it was in spring of '67 when Pink Floyd's first single was released, Arnold Layne. Just a 3-minute catchy pop single with some interesting textures thrown in for good measure. It was more raw, more upbeat, and instead of contemplative lyrics about the human condition, it was a song about a transvestite who steals women's clothes. Oh, I'm sure the conservative radio stations of the 60s loved this number. Though as influential as Syd's writing and performing are, the rest of the band should not be overlooked, even in these early days. Nick Mason's drumming sounds like something Ginger Baker would play on Cream records, but it's totally his own. Roger Waters' bass is really the heartbeat of Pink Floyd, and he'd often play like a second guitar. And you're gonna hear me say this a lot, but Rick Wright is Pink Floyd's secret weapon. Rick was more influenced by jazz, and his melodic choices are a nice contrast to Syd's erratic playing. Also, his harmonies are a big part of their early work. I love the way his harmony soars over Syd's in the first single. So how did all this come together? Well, in the early 60s, Roger Waters, Nick Mason, and Rick Wright were all architecture students, which kind of explains their unique way of constructing songs and albums later on. There were several lineup changes, but they eventually recruited Syd Barrett, a student of painting, whose musical tastes were very diverse, from the Beatles to Wagner. Of course, they all grew up listening to the early rock and roll and blues records, and if you listen to their earliest recordings, you can hear this influence on songs like Double O Bo, obviously a tribute to Bo Diddley and James Bond.
Bo Diddley was a private eye.
At the time, they were called the T-Set and featured another guitarist named Bob Close, who left the band in 1965, leaving Syd to become their lead guitar player. Syd wrote almost all of their songs, with Roger occasionally adding his own number. Because there was another band called the T-Set, Syd came up with the Pink Floyd sound, combining the names of two blues artists, Pink Anderson and Floyd Council. The counterculture and underground music scene was just starting to emerge at this time, and it is worth noting the controversial influence of LSD on Syd Barrett, which most likely did inspire Syd to see beyond the limitations of pop music writing before contributing to his breakdown. As Pink Floyd began to play lengthy shows around town, they started extending solos to fill out the set times.
The audience actually hated what we did, but UFO was the one area where people were interested in what we were doing, and it sort of kept us alive in a way.
They also started experimenting with psychedelic light shows, and they were performing some songs which would eventually appear on Piper at the Gates of Dawn. This caught the attention of Peter Jenner and Andrew King, who started managing the group. So they signed with EMI and released Arnold Layne, backed with Candy and the Currant Bun, produced by Joe Boyd from the UFO Club. But in summer of '67, while they were working on Piper, they released their breakthrough single, See Emily Play. I was fascinated by Emily the first time I heard it. Despite the psychedelic sonic backdrop, there's a childlike innocence to it, which would become a signature aspect of Syd's songwriting. It's easy to see why the song hit number 6 on the British charts. I've read some sources that claim it might have gone as high as number 5. But it would also put a lot of pressure on the band to live up to this success. Can they produce another hit like See Emily Play? Well, before that, they owed the record company their first full-length album, and that pretty much sets the stage for the Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Pink Floyd album reviews are underway, so I'll see you then.